So welcome to today's event, What is the role of CCUS in delivering clean growth? My name is Joshua Burke, I'm a senior fellow here at Policy Exchange. Delighted to have the panel we have today. So by way of introduction, we have the Right Honourable Claire Perry MP, Minister of State, Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. We have Andy Cost, Chief Executive of Drax Power Station, Charlotte Morgan, Chair of the Cost Challenge, and Phil McDonald from Sandbag. So I'll provide a little bit of context for today's event, and then we'll jump straight into thoughts from our panel. So CCUS is widely seen as a pivotal climate solution, essential to the success of Paris and the UK's clean growth. Indeed, 90% of the IPCC's scenarios for 2 degrees are predicated on a high level of CCUS. Yet it remains unproven at scale. Barriers relating to high capital costs continue. The CCUS Cost Challenge Task Force has been looking at the cost side specifically, and it's great that we've got Charlotte here who can provide some information on that. CCUS can be deployed in a number of sectors, such as decarbonising industry, or to scale up hydrogen production. A number of regional opportunities exist for CCUS, such as the North and Scotland, and again, I think this will be touched upon today. But before this is a reality, we need to consider what policies and regulatory framework are needed, and what more can industry do to deliver CCUS. So with that, I will hand straight to Claire for your thoughts.
Thank you, Josh. Morning. Hello, everybody. And can I just actually commend Policy Exchange, not to be too crawly this early, but I think you're doing a huge amount of work in this space, both around CCUS and also on the hydrogen economy. And of course, we've all sort of woken up to the fact that there are these many interlinkages, both across the generation and the industrial decarbonisation challenges. And also, I did want to pay tribute to Charlotte, if others don't, because one of the things I wanted to do was we kind of know what the problem is with CCUS, which is we all think it's absolutely essential, but we can't find a cost-effective way of doing it. And we're not alone in that. I mean, there are, I think, 21 at-scale CCS plants globally. 16 of them rely on the revenue stream from enhanced oil recovery, suggesting that 5 or 6 are actually reliant on very heavy taxpayer, usually taxpayer, often consumer subsidy. And we just think there is a better way to do it, and that is actually the challenge that we've been all wrestling with. But just a couple of setting points. The first is, it is the view of my department that CCUS is not optional for decarbonisation. We understand that the biggest pools of emissions in the UK are transport and industrial emissions, and there are some electric solutions for things like steel, cement, aluminium and chemicals, but there aren't enough of them, and we know we're going to need CCUS to actually drive down the emissions of those particular sectors. And of course, the argument is always it's cheaper to act now than later, and the ICC has come up with some quite helpful numbers suggesting that doing decarbonisation for 2 degrees without CCUS would cost an additional $3.5 trillion, 40% more expensive. These are all good arguments. You can tell I'm marshalling them to take to Philip Hammond in short order. And the other thing that is the sort of counterweight to this is a realisation, which we'll hear more about today with Greg Clark's speech, that showing leadership in this space is a massive opportunity for the UK. And I think this sort of the sort of triple test we now use for low carbon investments is, does it decarbonise? Can we do it at an effective cost? Can we keep consumer bills down? And can we somehow create a competitive advantage to deliver solutions to challenges that the rest of the world is facing? And I think that is a really important sort of conversation to have at the moment. We obviously talk to big, deep-pocketed private sector companies, some of them will be in the room, who are looking globally at where it is the right place to invest in CCS and CCUS, and we obviously want the UK to be in that leadership position. And it is interesting that Rotterdam, which is a bigger industrial hub than Teesside, already has a net zero 2050 target, and CCUS is very much part of that mix. So the conversation for us is about how can we do this cost effectively, and what is the right allocation of risk and reward to the public sector and the private sector. And Charlotte's team, the Cost Reduction Task Force, if you haven't seen the report, it is excellent, and it talks very much about the local agenda and how that can be brought to bear on coming up with fundable projects. We haven't forgotten use, and again, just to underline how very good the UK is in this challenge of how do you use carbon, the Aberdeen University spin out the carbon capture machine in the finals of the X Prize, Global X Prize. Lots of work going on creating carbon negative industry feedstocks and building materials, and indeed Charlotte's recommendations to actually brand those so you can then have a supply chain that pulls them through. And essentially, again, not just a UK opportunity, but a global opportunity for these identifiable low carbon commodities emerging. And I did want to say a word about bioenergy. We obviously got Drax here today, but there is a possibility from capturing biomass delivering negative emissions, which is something we would love to get cost effectively because it does give us elbow room for slower progress in other sectors. Very much seized of the need to do it now. To capture lower cost opportunities and also to create this UK advantage. Very interested in the regional model because based on regional clusters and regional expertise, there are huge opportunities to do, I was looking at the project up around Liverpool to actually do the generation, the hydrogen production, the hydrogen for transport, the carbon capture and storage, a really sort of unified ecosystem. And we are, I know there might be questions about, well, if you love all this, why did you cancel the competition? That comes up quite a lot. I will submit something quite radical, which is I think we're in a better economic position now than if we had done those investments 5 or 6 years ago. Because at that point, they were very expensive. They were focused on decarbonisation of coal, which we have managed now to effectively eliminate from the generation, or will do by 2025. And the appetite of the private sector to co-invest is much, much greater now. And I think the opportunities, therefore, to get better deals for taxpayers and consumers are there. And that's why you've seen we've committed funding in the Clean Growth Strategy last year. We set up the CCUS Council, chaired by James Smith. Again, we've got a wealth of expertise. We've also got the best we know possible reservoirs in the world, and we want to make sure we're all working together on the same page. We had the Cost Challenge Reduction Task Force, and we've also globally laid down the gauntlet. I took over the leadership in mission innovation of the CCUS strand, because again, I want to make sure that we are setting the agenda globally. So that's where we are. What we fundamentally want is projects that we can fund, working with the private sector and local authorities in a way that delivers the most cost-effective CCUS model for British taxpayers and consumers. And that is why I'm here today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Andy, I'll hand over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, firstly, thank you to the Minister for coming along today. And I think to really appreciate the recognition in the Clean Growth Strategy, the role that CCS can play. And I think it's great to hear the Minister say it's not an option, actually. It needs to happen, CCS. I think that's great. And I think the Committee for Climate Change, their update in June, talked about its importance as well, and it stressed the importance of CCS to achieve our 80% carbon reduction targets. And this is not just about decarbonising power as we continue to electrify maybe heat and transport, but also the production of hydrogen, which the Minister mentioned, for heating and transport as well. That CCS, whichever way you look at it, is very important for both. But I just wanted to give you my perspective, because I suppose I've been involved with CCS for some time. I was on the White Rose project that was cancelled. I'm a director of the Northern Powerhouse Partnership, and also I look after Drax Power. So I just wanted to give my observations really on those three elements. So firstly, from a White Rose perspective, I think we did learn a lot from that project. And I think what we did learn was technically CCS is feasible. All the various elements that are required to put CCS into a successful project are around today. As the Minister says, there are 21 projects out there at the moment. Where it fell down really was cost, and this was because of the commercial issues, the link between transport and storage and the power plant, and making sure that the transport and storage chain, they were protected from risks from the power project and vice versa. And so I think what I'm looking for now, and I think that the task force recognises this as well, is what we need to see actually, I think, is government support, and for government to seize the opportunity and support this. In much the same way we've seen cost reductions in offshore wind, which had the support and that long-term certainty from government. I think we need to see the same thing on CCUS. And I'm encouraged by recent talk of potentially using a regulated asset base for nuclear. I think this is the type of model that we need to see for the transport and storage network for CCS. And I think what you'll see then is private sector support coming forward. If you see that long-term government support, I think the private sector will indeed follow. The second point I wanted to make was really in relation to the Northern Powerhouse Partnership, and this is really a plug for the North. I wrote the energy section of the second report that the MPP compiled, and clearly what we saw was energy was a core competency. Whether you look at offshore wind, nuclear, bioenergy, and the old fossil fuels, the North has this in spades. And I think the CCUS task force recognised the key again to unlocking cost reductions in CCUS is clusters. And I think the North is ideally placed to deliver on that. Whether you look at the Humberside, whether you look at Teesside, whether you look at Merseyside, what we can see is creation of clusters, it creates jobs, it drives a low carbon economy, and it supports decarbonisation in industry where these areas are heavily dependent on industry, lots of jobs. We need to do this for the future. We need to decarbonise these sectors. So I think clusters is absolutely the right answer, and the North can deliver that. And then if I come on to Drax Power, and two points I wanted to make. Firstly, I think an often overlooked point around CCUS is its flexibility. And we are moving towards an electricity system with baseload nuclear, which is relatively inflexible, together with intermittent sources of renewable generation in wind and solar. And I think we all recognise that the costs of balancing the system are increasing, and we need flexible generation to balance that and to keep costs down. And if I just give you an example, just last week we had a very windy evening, and the costs of balancing the system were up at around £18 per megawatt hour. So balancing system use of services was around £18 per megawatt hour. If you just annualise that, and it is an extreme, but if you were to annualise that, you're talking about a £5 billion cost per annum of balancing the system, up from around £1.5 billion today. So CCS can really help to manage that by being a flexible source of generation, and that's what's needed to keep the costs down, and we see increasing needs for flexibility. The final point I wanted to make at Drax is that we are looking at BECCS, so bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, and we really do see this as a game changer because we believe we could become the first carbon negative plant in Europe. Now, it's been recognised by the Committee for Climate Change that we need BECCS. It could be up to 50 million tonnes per annum by 2050, and we believe that the plant at Drax can deliver 15 million tonnes of that, and we believe it can be done well ahead of 2050. The Minister mentioned it was a possibility. We believe it's a probability. We believe it's a very realistic aim of ours to do this, and we're already running a trial, and the trial this autumn will be able to capture 1 tonne per day. So not huge, but it's a start. We believe it will be successful. And what's really interesting, we've already got lots of industries and businesses who want to talk to us about harnessing that green CO2, as they call it, to be used in industrial processes. So that's something that we wish to build, and we believe clusters are needed by the mid-2020s. We believe we can be carbon negative by the mid-2020s, again with the right government support. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. Charlotte.
Thank you. I had the huge pleasure and privilege of chairing the CCUS Cost Challenge Task Force over the last 6 months. And this brought together over 52 participants from the CCUS industry to come together to work out how we could take CCUS forward in the UK. One of the key things, or the key themes of this conference is opportunity, and that's really what I wanted to say about CCUS. CCUS does provide a huge opportunity for the UK. First, as Claire said, for global leadership. If we are, in some respects ahead of our competitors in the way in which we approach energy investment, and we have shown through our policies that we can provide and galvanise whole industries around this. But also, the one thing that the CCUS task force did was really focus on the value to the UK economy of doing CCUS. We hear lots about the cost of doing it, but we hear much less about the value to the UK economy. And I think it is hugely important that that is focused on. There is an ability to retain significant amounts of very high-skilled jobs in the industry as the oil and gas sectors come off. There is the opportunity to create new industries using carbon through carbon use. But there is also the ability to decarbonise the industries that we have, and therefore make those industries much more competitive on the global stage. Consumers across the world are becoming more interested in the types of products that are used in what they consume, and therefore it is possible with CCUS to create new decarbonised steel, decarbonised cement, and other things which have the potential to create new revenue streams and new industries for the UK. Touching on the points which have been made about power as well, decarbonised power is something that we have been focused on, but CCUS also has the power to decarbonise other parts of the economy which can't be reached by more traditional technologies. Through the creation of hydrogen, we can begin to decarbonise transport, we can begin to decarbonise heat. Through the use of we can use CCUS to further decarbonise power. At the moment, 42% of the electricity system is actually balanced by unabated gas. Bringing in CCUS creates that ability to continue to be able to flex between the nuclear and the wind, as Andy mentioned, but in a decarbonised way. What we found when we were actually working on the task force was that we did need, as well as focusing on the huge value that can be created in CCUS, was how we brought down the cost of its implementation, and that was a key task which Claire set us when we were looking at this. And there are a number of things that we looked at as to how we could do that. It is very clear that deployment in and of itself has a huge impact on the ability to create cost savings through learning and through taking out risks. We've seen in offshore wind the strike price come down from 150 to 57 pounds per megawatt hour over a period of investment. And we do believe that by deploying CCUS, we would begin to see the strike price in respect of power also coming down. Through cluster implementation, which is a key plank of our policy, you bring together all of the different strands of CCUS, and you can create transportation and storage infrastructure which enables the value that I was talking about earlier to be created around that. And you attain additional cost savings through that cluster implementation. We've also looked at new business models and how those new business models could be used. A huge part of the cost of a CCUS in the previous competitions, which were judged to be too expensive, comes from the cost of capital employed, and part of that is to do with the huge risk premium that you have to put into the projects in order to get a financing away. By splitting the capture element from the transportation and storage element as recommended in the task force, and by creating new business models, you can significantly drive down the cost of capital. One of the examples that I always use is the way in which we managed to push down the cost for consumers of another large project which I was involved in, which was the Thames Tideway Tunnel project. There we reduced, through the business model we used, we reduced the cost per customer for each one of Thames Water's customers from £85 to £25. And the majority of that was by reducing the cost of capital through the business models that we were implementing. So part of the recommendations of the report is to look at the potential for using a RAB-based structure for the transportation and storage so that you access that lower cost of debt and equity. And the other aspects we looked at in terms of cost savings were the reuse of existing assets. We do have assets already in the North Sea. We also, as Claire referred to, have this huge geological advantage in the UK of being able to store CO2. And that allows us also to create new businesses, potentially on a pan-European basis, to store carbon from other European nations. So one of the things that it has been a huge privilege to do is to look both at that balance between value and cost, and say that overall, when you put the value part in and you look at the cost reductions that we can, that CCUS is something which the UK should do and it should become a world leader in.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Phil.
So I want to take you back to summer 2017 and a election where there was an outsider candidate whose polling was looking really bad for him. And then by the end of summer 2017, he had overturned the polls. And of course, I'm talking about the May 2017 Tees Valley mayoral election, where Ben Houchen had a surprise win, and he was running on a platform which, to not some insignificant part, included a promise to return industrial jobs to Tees Valley, to rebuild where a lot of the industry had been lost, and he was talking about CCUS and getting a Tees Valley cluster. And then that was followed in the general election, Simon Clarke winning in Middlesbrough. Again, another surprise Tory win, where talking about CCS through the campaign was very important for getting these surprise Tory wins. So I wanted to make the point that we know CCS is essential for net zero. We know CCS is important for pursuing a mixed approach to how we get our energy. So looking at nuclear, CCS, and renewables instead of just putting all our eggs in one basket. But it also is a vote winner, and I think that's been shown particularly in Tees Valley. So given that, what are the policies that will get CCS actually rolling instead of it being a campaign promise? How can it be turned into something physical on the ground? And how can we get the first industrial CCS clusters and negative emissions CCS happening very soon? What I think we should recognise first is that CCS should be focused on as an industrial story rather than a power sector story now. It's been tried for quite some time that it was a way of rescuing coal, dealing with emissions from coal. That has disappeared now. But when we look at what's happening to any base load outside of nuclear, that's beginning to disappear. And I think we see by even on BEIS's quite small c conservative statistics for the 2020s, by 2025 gas is down to about 20% of the power sector. So CCS could hitch its wagon to trying to decarbonise a dwindling part of the power sector, or it can stick with industry, which is something which we will need to keep relying on. We need to keep building the wind turbines for our fantastic offshore wind industry. So I would say that should really be the focus for where we're going with CCS now, focusing on industry. What are some policies for how we can do it? Obviously, industrial clusters are going to be very important, and looking at trying to bring together lots of different businesses is work that's already begun in Tees Valley. It's happening in Grangemouth. It's happening. Also interesting, with Cadent in Liverpool and Manchester. I think it's very important as well to be looking at North Sea decommissioning and the cost that we can save by reusing old infrastructure there. There's some evidence from Scottish Carbon Capture and Storage Association looking at the Acorn project at St Fergus and Caledonia Clean Energy in Grangemouth, looking at how much reusing the pipelines can save billions off those projects. And so instead of having a huge cost from decommissioning to the taxpayer, we can offset that shifting to reusing some of those things, which I think is obviously beneficial. So I think it's important, obviously, that the UK acts now, because we have, as some of the other panelists have talked about, we have Rotterdam, which is moving ahead. We have Norway. Both of them are promising to begin capture before 2020. So there's a North Sea prize and a prize in creating the cost-effective CCS technology that we can then be selling to the rest of the world and the rest of Europe post-Brexit. So it's important that the UK acts before our neighbours.
Excellent, thank you. So, Claire, you mentioned that you were marshalling the arguments for Philip Hammond. What do you think the level of buy-in is from the Treasury at the moment, given what happened last time with the CCS competition?
Well, I think you have to look at a couple of things to sort of realise how important the whole agenda is to the government. It was very interesting, actually, Phil, to hear your point about the local importance of it. And Ben is a doughty campaigner for this, as is Simon. I don't know if they're in the room, but they do a very good job. It's no accident that I now attend Cabinet at the kids' end, where the plastic cups are, because this whole clean growth, and I think you mentioned it, the sort of post-Brexit opportunity for leadership, and something that the UK is actually incredibly good in, whether it's offshore wind or it's innovation in this space. We are really good at this stuff, and for too long we've acted as if we haven't actually done very well, whereas in fact we're absolutely in a global leadership position in terms of our decarbonisation. So I think there is a broad interest and appetite to be investing in these technologies, but also, rightly, we don't want to put bills up for consumers. And one of the great sort of triumphs, if you like, over the last couple of years has been the ability to show that consumer bills have fallen in the household, because although whilst policy costs have put prices up, volumes have decreased as we have more energy efficiency. But we also are aware that in a competitive world, energy costs are high for some of our core industries. And that's because Germany chooses to smear their policy costs across consumers and protect industry. We don't do that. But I think it's right to be thinking all the time about how can we do this in the most cost-effective way. And Charlotte's evidence from Thames Tideway is really compelling. If we can actually sit down and work out what is that irreducible core of cost and risk that the public sector has to bear, and all of the benefits that have been talked about. And actually, I mean, nobody had ever mentioned before the task force, and indeed before Phil's comments, the avoided cost of decommissioning. It's an obvious thing, and you don't always make investment decisions on avoided costs, but that is something we have not thought about. So we haven't thought strategically about some of our most important assets. So, Philip is a man of calculation and spreadsheet, but I like to bring facts to bear in these debates. And so, and of course, we have managed with both the 100 million from the CCUS Innovation Fund and also the preservation of our CFD money, 557 million, to extract funding for the Treasury in over several years to support all sorts of low carbon technology, of which this could be one.
Excellent. One question for the panel. Higher carbon price is often regarded as being quite an important factor in the deployment of CCS. I was interested to see the panel's views on what post-Brexit carbon pricing might look like, if we will remain in the ETS, if the panel think that's possible, and if not, what would be their options for an alternative? Would it be a UK scheme linked, or would it be an independent carbon tax, such as the one Policy Exchange put forward? I'll make a plug there. I'll hand that over to the panel. Andy?
Yeah, I'm happy to say that. I mean, we're a big believer in a strong carbon price, and I think whether it's for any renewable or low carbon technology, I think it's absolutely critical that we do continue to see pricing for carbon, and it remains at a high level. I mean, but at a level that, when we say high, I think actually we're talking about what is the price of carbon to decarbonise and get us to the 2 degrees scenario and possibly onto the Paris 1.5 degree scenario. So I think it certainly needs to be there. I think the industry as a whole supports staying within the internal energy market. I think the easiest thing would be to preserve the status quo and remain part of the EU ETS. I think we are seeing the EU ETS go up significantly. I mean, it's moved from €6-7 beginning of the year to over 20. And I think that's encouraging, and I think we're starting to see the reforms happening in that mechanism coming to bear, which is great. The alternative, I think, a UK ETS scheme or the policy exchange proposal, I mean, they all, I mean, each of those have merit. My slight concern with the tax is that, again, is it something, again, that can be invested behind? I know that Policy Exchange have some views on how to ensure that it isn't subject to political influence, but I think to Charlotte's point, bringing down the cost of capital, really important ultimately to the end consumer. And if we have that investment certainty, that's the sort of thing that will enable cost of capital to come down. So, yeah, a high carbon price, very, very much something we support.
Yes, I agree. I mean, I think, and Andy made the point that, you know, we have been campaigning for years for reforms to the EU ETS and been very much in the front for vanguard of that, and they are starting to work, which is excellent. And I mean, I said to my officials, candidly, show me all the alternatives. You know, if we have an opportunity to do something better that drives a better set of outcomes for the UK, I'd like to see them. But at the moment, you know, there doesn't appear to be any benefit for business in doing something that is different, particularly with the price signals improving. But I am interested, I'm fascinated to know that the Republicans are pushing the kind of tax and dividend model in the US. So I think we should never shut our minds to doing something. And we are a great leader in market trading systems, and it should be something that we should continue to look for. But I think Andy also hit the nail on the head that we're not good at hypothecated taxes in the UK. And actually, if we're going to create some sort of cost burden on the basis that it drives better investment, that is not traditionally the model. Not to say it can't be done, but it's not the model we've used. So I think we'll stick with what we've got, unless people in the room have very strong arguments otherwise. But so far, the arguments have suggested the system's working. We should keep going with it, subject to negotiation.
Yeah. And what's your sense on that? How likely is that?
You know, again, I come from sort of, you know, it's in no one's interest for the UK to drop out of the ETS. I mean, or indeed out of the SEM. I mean, putting aside all the rather ghastly risk to the Northern Irish market. I mean, so I think there is rationality is prevailing on this stuff. And of course, from an effort share basis, because often the two briefs are combined, both the climate change and the energy one, you know, we have quite a lot to offer the EU because we have overachieved, if you like, relative to our contribution to the overall EU share. So we are, you know, so far it seems fine.
Excellent. Any of the panels want to comment?
I think the only thing I would say is that the UK needs to be competitive in a global market, and therefore having a price signal which is only specific to our, to our jurisdiction is potentially problematic. I would endorse what Claire says around the European Union actually is very keen to keep what we've achieved in terms of decarbonisation in the overall scheme of things, given there are certain parts of other European countries which haven't had the same success in decarbonising that we have. And I think being within the EU ETS is probably the right way to go, assuming that can be negotiated. But there does seem to me to be a win-win scenario on both sides in respect of that.
Thank you. Phil, anything to add?
Yeah, I'd just say that it's often missed how cost effective it is to do carbon pricing rather than regulation. We're seeing that at the minute with the UK has had great success with its coal phase out just through the carbon tax, just through among other policies. But carbon tax primarily has pushed that really pushed coal almost to zero now, and the importance of keeping that. When we see in Germany they're trying to now regulate out of their lignite to begin with, they're paying the lignite producers to sit in a reserve. It's huge costs to the taxpayer, instead of as the way the UK has done it, which is receiving money through the carbon tax. So we need to make sure that that's continued with, and especially as we go towards the coal phase out, we need to make sure that carbon tax is staying high or medium high as it is at the minute.
Fantastic. Plenty of time for questions, so I'll take a clutch in 3. So the gentleman there, the gentleman at the back, and the gentleman in the fleece. If you could state your name and organisation, please.
Yeah. Tom Greatrex, Nuclear Industry Association. Just on the, Charlotte, you were talking about the regulated asset base, and we have a shared interest in this and the impact on the capital cost of capital-intensive long-term projects. But compared to the Thames Tideway, is your suggestion, your work, that you can use exactly the Thames Tideway model, or how far it would need to change? And to Claire, when you're lobbying the Chancellor on some of these issues, often it has been the Treasury that's been sceptical of different financing models. But when it has the impact on consumer costs and end user costs that a regulated asset base has been proved in the Thames Tideway, do you think then there's hope for that model being something which you can convince the Treasury of the merits of?
Thank you. Actually, it was a very long question, so we'll take that one first, and then we'll go to the gentleman there.
Nice to see you at a Tory conference, Tom. Well done. I hope you're enjoying your new job. So I think it's a really important question. I think what's changed actually is, and I think somebody said this, that it's a difference in view from seeing CCS as an add-on to generation. It's always just been seen as a cost. Well, why would you do CCS or CCUS when you can buy offshore wind at tumbling prices? And I think that is the mindset that is changing. That now, because there are so many other benefits there, the willingness to think about it in a more holistic way, and therefore as a structural asset. And somebody made I think it might have been. Somebody on the task force, that we have always co-invested in utility infrastructure in this UK. It's been a public-private investment for many years, and what we're talking about is doing a similar thing for carbon transport, and we just need to think a bit more holistically about it. But I am convinced that the answer is in the industrial clustering of it, because there is both a political and a real economic incentive to bring together businesses in an area and look at what the local infrastructure needs to be. I think that actually applies to a lot of energy conversations, but particularly when it comes to industrial decarbonisation. So I think there is an appetite actually out there for these more holistic views. And I've never say never, but ultimately I think it's good that we have a Chancellor who cares about numbers. Actually, and if you can make the argument with numbers, which I think many of us now feel much more confident doing, we stand a much better chance of getting investment out, as we have done with the CFDs and the innovation funding that we've had so far.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, if I go back to the White Rose project, this was the power plant was going to sort of emit around 2 million tonnes, and we were building a pipeline to capture 17 million tonnes. But the pipeline was wrapped up in the original project cost. And it was very clear that as soon as that infrastructure was in place, the second, third, fourth tranche of projects coming on, particularly around the Humber linking in industry, would come down dramatically. And I think that's the key to it. I think Treasury at the time balked at the cost, but that was really because it was covering all of the TNS infrastructure as well as that first project. And I think we have to look longer term and holistically across the whole chain.
Thank you. Charlotte?
Yeah, I mean, if I can say a couple of words about the RAB structure. RAB structures or regulated asset-based structures are commonly used where you're creating new infrastructure, and that infrastructure needs to be flexible enough to allow it to change over time. So your classic RAB structures would be the rail networks or the transmission networks in the UK. In terms of generally speaking, we have already this division between how we deal with transmission assets, how you get the power from one place to another, and generation assets, and the two business models are different. And what we're advocating here is that part of the project, which is the transportation and storage part, is better served by using a regulated asset-based model, so that as other people link up to it, the costs of that can be shared across projects. The other thing it's really important to remember is if we want to engage and bring in private sector finance for CCUS, and we want to do that at the lowest possible cost, then there is a huge amount of capital available for regulated assets. That's one of the reasons we chose it for Tideway. There is over $1 trillion of private sector investment looking for good opportunities to invest, and there are not that many of them. If you can access that money by creating a business structure which is attractive to those investors, then you can bring them in. And it is worth saying that a regulated utility in terms of where it's placing its rates of return is in the sort of 8 to 11% bracket. Whereas if you take project finance, which the original projects were forced down a project finance route, you're looking at equity returns between 15 and 17. So you can already see, just by choosing a different model, you can access a much cheaper cost of capital. And that's what we did in Tideway, and that's why it drove such a difference for consumers. And I think that's really important.
Phil, anything to add?
I'd only say that I feel like with the CCS industry so far, there's always been a desire to try and find the perfect kind of mega project, bringing in, as Andy's saying, looking at like oversizing and such like. And I wonder if the way to kind of get the industry going might be starting with small bits of capture there, which can be, the CO2 can be utilised and stored, beginning to get an industry working, which is the same way that we worked with wind. I mean, it will take small pots of government money, but maybe that can get things going before we have the first big project.
Excellent. Ralph, the gentleman there.
Phil Clark from Orpington. I'm just an ordinary party member. I'm also a shareholder in Drax, which has been a deeply depressing experience. And it certainly exposes you to the wrong end of government policy, as it's on, off. Anyway, that aside, just actually deeply interested. It seems like a terribly good idea, but how much capacity is there? So how many years can Drax pump CO2 underground? And also, what are the actual risks? Because there's a lot of difference between drilling a hole underground and letting natural gas out and pumping pressurized gas underground. What are the dangers? And are we taking any risks here that perhaps we should know about?
Thank you. Andy?
Yeah, I mean, again, through the White Rose project, there was a lot of work done around the feasibility of using the North Sea. And actually, I think, as Claire said, the UK has this, I mean, we are ideally placed with the reserves that we have, either aquifers or disused oil and gas fields. I mean, hundreds of years of storage. So, I mean, if the transport network is there, and if the ability to move CO2 out into the North Sea is there, and also there's the Northwest as well, where they also have similar access. I mean, I don't believe that is a constraint. Also, I mean, I'm not an oil and gas person, but again, from the work we did through that, I mean, there are risks, but they are manageable. And again, nobody was suggesting that if we were to put CO2 out into these sort of areas in the North Sea, that there would be any risks associated with it, or none that couldn't be managed very well. And there's plenty of precedent there elsewhere in the world. So I think it's all feasible. It just needs the right momentum behind it, politically and from business as well.
Thank you. Anyone on the panel?
It's a really good question, and I just wanted to point out that, you know, since the cancellation of the projects, I think we've spent about 300 million quid as a government doing things like researching the aquifers. And as Andy, I mean, one of the things we could do is store other European countries' CO2. They're that good. And we're doing quite a lot of work with the Norwegians, because we basically took the hydrocarbons out of the North Sea basin together and talk about putting the CO2 back. But again, it is a really good idea. And I should say this because it's a Conservative conference. I mean, you know, the first person who ever talked about climate change on the world stage was Mrs. Thatcher. And this idea that somehow we're sort of anti-environmentalists, what we've always done is driven, you know, a very active agenda, and also looked to partner with industry to deliver solutions. And we should go away from this conference feeling really good about the fact that, according to PwC, only 2 countries in the world are doing enough to get to even a 2-degree temperature rise, and that's us and China. So don't let anyone tell you that, you know, we are not the party of environmentalists. We absolutely are, but we want to do it in a way that doesn't put too much of a burden on our businesses that are competing globally, or hard-pressed consumers. Yeah, thank you very much. And I'm not standing for leader, just so you know. So I was very clear that was not an attempt to try and get votes.
Anyone else?
I mean, just to say that there is a difference between the shorter-term storage risk and the longer-term storage risk, and the private sectors. I mean, Claire, as she said earlier, asked us on the task force to look at what the irreducible sort of kind of core of risks which may need to. May need to be allocated between the parties, and it's very clear that the private sector is very comfortable with the short-term risk, but it is much harder for the private sector to take sort of the long-term storage risk once you've filled the store and you've capped it off, and you're looking at the sort of kind of longer-term picture. So there is some residual risk there is some residual risk that government may end up taking, and that's already recognised in the way in which we've put the regulations in place, and the UK's been pretty quick to deal with some of the issues relating to that.
Thank you. Neil?
Yeah, just that I really see CCS as a stopgap solution. Like we've got to be mitigating very rapidly. We've got to be reducing emissions down to zero by 2050, and CCS is going to help us reduce emissions along that pathway, and then maybe deal with the little bit of leftovers where we can't find the technologies to deal with it. It's a way of reducing risk by having CCS there to just be able to deal with those technologies. But I wouldn't see it happening for hundreds of years in the future, because it's a kind of a generational problem. The long-term storage is something that we're passing on to our kids to say, well, you have to carry on storing CO2, you have to carry on looking after it. It would be best if we could avoid doing that.
Thank you. What, gentleman there?
Hi, Warwick Clive for Policy Exchange. This question fits very neatly with what Claire has just said, and is stimulated by both Phil and Claire's and Andy's interventions. I wonder if you give us a hint of the compare and contrast with the UK approach to these issues, the sharing of burdens between consumers and industry, the use of regulation versus pricing and tax, and the approach to taking technologies with very high externalities like coal and lignite out, because I think I don't have a proper purchase list, so it is a question. I think the contrast between Germany and the UK is very interesting, and I just wondered if you could flesh it out for us.
Thank you. Who wants to begin that one? Charlotte?
I can have a go. And I think the UK has always tried to encourage the private sector to invest alongside and to look at some of the opportunities which come out of investing alongside. In terms of regulation, one of the things, the difference between regulation and doing something else, I think one of the things we were really keen on the task force to do was to make sure that we were appropriately balancing the risks between different types of consumers and taxpayers. So, for example, when we talk about the hydrogen economy and what hydrogen can do for heat, one of the things that we were looking at was whether it was appropriate to have a business model which shared the cost of decarbonising heat with gas consumers in a way that electricity consumers have borne a lot of the costs so far in the system associated with decarbonising electricity, and we were very keen to do that. We also looked at the question of what is the appropriate business model for the decarbonisation of industry, and given that one of the beneficiaries of industry is obviously the UK taxpayer, we have actually looked at a business model which puts the costs of decarbonising industry perhaps more with the taxpayer through the use of a tax credit. So what we're always trying to do is to make sure that we are very conscious of where we're putting costs and where we're putting the cost burden. There are, and this has come up in the PAC reports, for example, on the Hinkley project, where the Public Accounts Committee has looked at that, the idea of whether taxation or using consumers is the right way to go, and there are questions around using consumers because it's seen as more aggressive in the sense that it's something which you can't avoid if you're in a lower income bracket. But what governments have always got to do is balance, when it's putting costs on to consumers, how it protects the most vulnerable in society, and there are other mechanisms which can be used to deal with that. On the continent, a lot of governments use much more taxpayers' money than they do consumers. But you have to remember that most taxpayers are also consumers of electricity and are also consumers of heat. So there is a fine balance in the way in which in the way that you do that. But I think one of the things that I've always understood from the current government is that they do look at the overall burden, not only of taxation, but of also parts of sort of unavoidable cost. And so as long as you're getting the balance right, and as long as you're protecting the most vulnerable in society, it is still possible to create those arbitrages between them.
Thank you.
I mean, it's a really excellent question, actually, because it gets to this whole heart of, I think, lots of questions about the party and are we regulators or are we free marketeers? And in this space, it's been particularly interesting because we have had quite a tough statutory framework, which is the carbon budgets. It's 10 years since the Climate Change Act supported cross-party, and that has put all sorts of things in place, like the requirement to report every 5 years on how we're doing with our CO2 budgets. And of course the UNFCCC framework as well, the Paris Agreement has provided a sort of intergovernmental framework, one that is being worked up at the moment. I think it's a constant interplay between sort of signalling ambition, which drives market responses. So one of the really fascinating questions is how fast we'll take fossil fuel vehicles off the road right now, and how much we have signalled our desire to have new cars be fossil free by 2040, and now there's lots of pressure to say bring it forward. But it was no accident that was followed up very rapidly by companies now rolling out all of their electric ranges. So there's a constant sort of signalling of ambition, a regulatory aspect to it, because actually we have regulated industries here. So if we are putting costs on consumers, that's going through a regulatory framework, and we have to be mindful of that. But also a realisation that, I'm not one of these technology will solve all the problems. I'm in this. I think we need a balance. But a realisation that we can actually create competitive advantage by doing this. One of the things I think we haven't done as well as we could have done historically is the UK content coming out of the offshore wind industry. So we put in place some exceptionally good mechanisms for pulling forward offshore wind as part of the generation mix. It's now very cheap, but we were not robust in asking companies to locate manufacturing and create jobs in the UK. And I think what we're now seeing is the opportunity to use government ambition and regulation to actually drive jobs and productivity. And that is if you like, the heart of the industrial strategy. But there is always the danger of over meddling. And I was actually really interested in what you said about the German model. It was one of the most depressing things was going to the annual climate change conference last year in Bonn, and seeing the barges of coal sailing past, kind of 2 fingers up to all you people talking about climate change. We're just going to keep digging up our coal. And it's quite a depressing state that the solution to that is this highly interventionist, regulated solution where, as you say, government will be paying out and not receiving. I'm looking forward to Katowice in a few months. That's going to be a similarly interesting place to be discussing climate change. So it is a balance, and we have to get the balance right. But again, I do think countries look to us to say, you did a good job. You drove a market. You can always argue, as Dieter Helmwood, that we spent too much, and he could be right on that. But you created a market, you supported it adequately, and then you let a market mechanism drive costs down. And the missing part has been getting the onshoring of the jobs and productivity, which I think we can do.
Thank you. Andy?
Yeah, I would add, EMR, the electricity market reform, it was quite painful to go through. I think it was quite necessary, but I think it was done as a package of measures which tried to cover a number of things, and therefore, if we look at, we had the carbon price floor, capacity mechanism, CFDs and emission performance standard. You put all of those together, and actually, is it driving the right outcome in the energy sector, the electricity sector in the UK? And I think you'd have to say that it is. And actually, we're now going through the 5-year review, and I think the message coming back is, yes, there are things that we can tinker with, but actually, does it still stand the test of time? Yes, it does. And I think people recognise it. Again, it's something that can be invested behind. I think with Germany, we had nuclear phase-out, which came in very, very quickly. We had the rapid growth of renewables. And actually, what we have seen is emission levels in Germany actually going up. And I think that's possibly because there's been a number of different policy measures, regulations coming out, which when you pull them all together, they haven't quite gelled, and there's been the law of unintended consequences. At least with EMR, I think it was fully thought through. As I say, it was pretty painful, but it was a massive change for the industry, but it is bearing fruit.
Thank you. Phil, anything to add?
Just that carbon pricing was very good for power, and that's worked very nicely, but it isn't able to have the same effect on industry, because you can't move a coal plant to China, but you can move your factory to China. So there's across Europe, we've had this problem where industrial emissions have been quite stable, apart from a bit of energy efficiency. So I do think we probably have to look for different way, rather than just rely on carbon pricing, there is going to be need for some regulation and probably innovation funding, particularly like getting the new technologies going and then letting a price signal do the work after that. So it's going to be a different role for industry.
Great. We've got time for 2 more questions. We can take the gentleman at the back and the lady in the purple or blue.
Thank you. Alex Murley from Minergy. The Minister mentioned tumbling offshore wind prices. Onshore wind is the lowest cost of new form generation bar none. Solar is reaching grid parity. One of the things that Drax power stations have benefited the system in previous years is the flexibility of your plant. You can get out the way when low-cost variable renewables come online, and you can come back on when the sun isn't as shiny as it is this morning. Given that anything that stays in the way will force us almost to turn off our wind or turn off our solar plants or increase the cost of our lowest form of new generation, will CCS, CCUS, adapted for Drax power plants, maintain the benefits your power plants offer as a system in terms of your flexibility?
Andy?
Well, I think that's the aim, absolutely. I mean, when we, again, going to the White Rose projects, one of the key things that we looked at was ensuring the plant was flexible. And I think that's certainly something that we would want to see if we go down the BECCS route, so bioenergy with CCS. I couldn't agree with you more around the need for flexibility, either to hit our carbon targets or to do so in the most cost-effective way. And flexibility on this system in the future is absolutely critical.
Anything?
I mean, there's just one thing that I would really like to add. I think when people talk about wind investment, and wind investment's been a huge part of our decarbonisation, people do talk about the intermittency, but they also don't quite pick up the load factor differentials between some of the different technologies. Because, I mean, wind power, it's sort of kind of, it's got a load factor of about, 40 to 50%, depending on exactly, sort of where it's calibrated. Whereas for a base load plant, you can turn it on and you can run it at 100%. You're not dependent on externalities. So I think when we think about investment, we do need to start having a much wider conversation with the British public about exactly what these technologies cost in their wider sense, and in the sense of what the whole system costs is. I think we do need to have an open and honest debate about that, because I think at the moment we tend only to look at the strike prices, and when you only look at the strike prices, those are not comparable across different technologies, and that's one of the reasons why CCUS and nuclear have been seen as incredibly expensive, but they have an enormous role to play in the system as a whole. Because otherwise what we end up doing is we end up having to put in place the capacity market or other balancing services, which actually are less flexible and less decarbonised than we might have in other forms. So I think I think it is really time now for a wider debate about how much the whole system costs. Because obviously offshore wind has been a fantastic story, as has solar as part of the mix. But we do need to look at security of supply and balancing of the system in the wider context.
And can I say, I mean, I get into trouble with scientists when I say that not all electrons are kind of created equal in this space. And I think the value of preserving this flexibility of energy supply is the overseas opportunities. That I'm sort of gobsmacked that, we are so far ahead of the rest of the world in offshore wind, for example. I mean, America's just opening its first offshore wind plant, Taiwan its second. But other countries are taking a very different view of their energy mix. And I don't want to be Germany, putting all our eggs into one ideological basket and then suddenly having to burn more coal to keep the lights on and costs down. And I think by having that flexibility and investing in these technologies we know the world needs, we have got huge opportunities to be world leaders. And I think Charlotte's point about these costs, the kind of whole system costs, is really important. But of course, I've requested advice on a zero carbon 2050 future. We know we're going to have to face some of these tough challenges, but we know the cost of not acting now is only going to get higher. So even if it's a 30 or 40 year project, most of us won't be here then, and we will have created a system that actually is delivering low carbon energy and export opportunities, and isn't that a price worth paying?
Thank you. We're going to take the last question very quickly. We've got 1 minute remaining, so answers nice and concise. Name and organisation, please. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Sasha Stashvik. We're an international environmental NGO. As some of you may know, earlier this year, the Channel 4 news program Dispatches aired an investigation into Drax's sourcing of wood pellets in the southeastern United States. And It raised some really significant questions about carbon reduction claims being made at Drax's plants. Also showed some troubling images of hundreds of acres of bottomland hardwood forest being clear-cut to supply pellet mills that eventually source Drax. I know that at an APPG event shortly thereafter, Minister Perry, you were asked about this, and you had said that you asked base staff to do a deep dive into the concerns raised, and I really commend you for that. I was wondering if you could share what you've learned from that deep dive.
Thank you. Andy first.
Yeah, well, thank you. We talk a lot about our biomass sustainability, and I think we're very proud of what we've been doing since we've been working with biomass now for 10 years. And I just want to say, actually, in response to the Dispatches report actually that came out, I actually travelled over to the US and I actually looked at the sites that have been mentioned in that report and others, and I went on a tour of these sites, and I was very comforted and more comforted than I have been in the past around how we are looking after those forests, how those forests are regrowing, how we're supporting jobs in those local areas, and how the forests are growing more than ever before on the basis of the demand that we provide, as well as others in the forest products industry. And forest cover in the US has doubled in the last 50 years. So I'm very comfortable with our sustainability sourcing policy, and when we talk about moving to a carbon negative position, I believe that's absolutely the case.
Final words.
And, well, I think one of the things the deep dive threw up were some questions actually about consumer biomass installations. And one of the things, and I absolutely accept the work Andy's done, and the good thing about having kind of big responsible partners is they take these corporate responsibilities seriously. I have been concerned, particularly over the winter when there were supply shortages, about what has been happening in the domestic installation, and obviously with reforms to RHI coming forward, but also a lot of conversations with boiler manufacturers to say how do we get to buy more sustainable biofuels if we're going to be doing this on a household basis. So it is something we keep under review, but I am satisfied with what Drax has done. But I think there are some practices out there, particularly in the domestic supply chain, that don't stand up to such scrutiny.
Thank you. I'm afraid we're going to have to call time there. Big thank you for Drax for helping put this on, and a thank you for everyone for attending. Thank you.